Protests inspired by the Occupy Wall Street movement in New York spread around the world. Just how serious is this a threat to global capitalism? Hello and welcome to A Simple Question with me, Phil Rees. Protesters opposed to corporate greed and gross inequalities remain in camps in cities the world over, including here in London in the plaza of St. Paul's Cathedral. Well, for more than 3 decades, neoliberal economic policies have served the interests of the super rich. Will popular resistance overthrow this global economic order? Well, before we find out what the people think here on the streets of London, here's a short video clip.
In September, a group of protesters gathered in the New York road that symbolizes global capitalism. At first, the Occupy Wall Street movement received little attention in the mainstream media. Then, in a matter of weeks, the Occupy movement went global. Ripple protests spread across the Western world, led by grassroots groups and individuals who declared that they refused to pay for the banking crisis. By October, Occupy protests had taken place in over 80 countries, with demonstrations at over 600 locations in the United States. The protesters in Wall Street say they represent the 99%. That's a reference to the Nobel Peace-winning economist Joseph Stiglitz, whose study showed that 1% of Americans own 40% of its wealth. On October 15th, hundreds of protesters gathered in London's banking centre to express their anger at corporate greed and to defend the UK's public services. The London Stock Exchange was the initial target for the protesters, but as they attempted to occupy the square, police sealed off the entrance. The square outside the Stock Exchange is private property, and a High Court injunction has been granted against public access to the area. Failing to enter the London Stock Exchange, the protesters occupied St. Paul's Square and set up camp outside its famous cathedral. The City of London Corporation, the municipal body controlling the square mile where financial institutions are situated, had threatened to seek a legal action to evict the protesters. But after St. Paul's Cathedral abandoned its legal action against the camp, the City Corporation said it wanted to avoid a confrontation and agreed that the protest can remain until a later date in 2012. But it has since renewed its threats to take legal action against the St. Paul's occupation. Giles Fraser, the former canon of St. Paul's, who resigned rather than see protesters evicted by force, welcomed the demonstrations, saying he was happy for people to exercise their right to protest peacefully. Today, there are over 200 tents in the square, and they are determined to remain until their demands are met.
A Simple Question is a show that finds out what the public thinks here on the streets of London. Well, I began today by asking what people knew about the protesters camped outside St. Paul's and why they thought they were here.
Well, I just know the same as everybody else. I've seen it on TV and I've read about it in the newspapers, and I know that that's a disparate group of people protesting generally about capitalism and generally about the way in which the bankers have let the nation down, I suppose.
I know that there's a protest, but it's not really been explained kind of to people who don't really know what it's about.
What do you know about the people protesting here at St. Paul's?
Well, I know that they represent a very large number of people who are unhappy with the way that the financial system has brought us into an awful recession that could have been avoided.
I know it's a massive anti-capitalist sort of demonstration, and that it's all got a little bit out of hand by the looks of it. They've kind of taken over and they're refusing to budge. But it's not just in England, is it? It's sort of a lot wider, or the movement is wider anyway. It's kind of, I think it was in the US to start with, was it?
What do you know about these protesters that are here outside St. Paul's?
Well, only what I've read in the newspaper, really, which is that they're protesting about the inequality, I think, in society as it is at the moment. And they seem to be focused on finance and the bankers in the city. which personally I think is a bit unfair, because I think there are footballers as well who could be paying their tax.
We actually have our own demonstration similar to that over in Belfast as well. As far as I'm aware, it's mostly to do with the economic crisis. Generally speaking, it's a protest against bankers, against the regime, against the government.
We've been seeing them all sort of camped out outside St Paul's, and there's a lot of sort of arguments really going on between that and the church itself, and there's been a lot really going on.
Why are these protests taking place?
I guess people are fed up with rich people, or with people are fed up with capitalism.
Well, I think economically everybody's feeling the pinch, especially the students. I've got young children that would like to go through the educational system. It's going to cost me a lot of money. So those that are in it at the moment are feeling the pinch. They're leaving their studies with large amounts of financial pressure in terms of loans and stuff. So I think they've got a claim to be there.
I think it's about the big cats in the city having all these big wages, and everybody else is having to skimp and save and exist on a small amount of wages.
There's varied aspects to it. It's a sort of a fairly wide tent umbrella that they're looking at, but basically they're protesting the inequalities in the system, which has been obvious for quite some time, but because of the current bad economy is particularly acute for a lot of people, and people are suffering because of it, and they're protesting general inequality, poor job prospects, and a partial breakdown of the capitalist system.
Generally, we've got a lot of concerns and we're not being listened to, and we want to have a voice. A lot of people talk about real democracy, and I think a lot of issues get caught up in that because this is what we're not being heard about, but I think that's the reason we're there.
We all talk about these things, and if people don't actively create a voice, a larger voice, these things don't really get heard by those that matter, those in power. So it may have only been a few people really in global terms, but actually the impact is huge.
Why are these protests taking place here?
I would say that people are fed up with the system, with many things. Myself, I'm fed up with all the killing that goes on in the world. You could find somebody else and they're fed up of the education, NHS. So it isn't one thing, it's everything. It's all messed up.
Specifically, because they've got no other way to have a say about what's going on. There needs to be some way that we all know that we can sort of complain as one. The protest is really the only thing they can do to have a voice about what they think about, the top end of society being able to get away with what they get away with.
I think they're protesting because the events of the past maybe got, 2 years and leading up to that have put people in a very awkward situation. Financially and emotionally, and things are a little bit unsettled at the moment, I guess.
Well, those are the views of the public here on the streets of London. Let's find out what our experts think.
What you've had with Occupy London is you've had people having, instead of some dominant personalities deciding the agenda, you've had general assemblies where they've discussed, you've taken everybody's view into account, come to some sort of consensus about what the next step is, how to push that forward. There are different people there with different objectives and different particular policies that they would like to see. I think fundamentally everybody's trying to get to some, to identify what needs to change in order to stop this system working in a way where it's constantly transferring wealth from the vast majority to a very small minority, and an economic system that works in the interests of ordinary people rather than just the few who know how to play the system.
I think that's quite indicative of a more grassroots pro-democracy movement that is unfolding in England and elsewhere, obviously in the United States as well, but also in South America and Australia, New Zealand. It could be classified as a global movement. From my contact with some of the people involved in the movement, it just seems to be a general cry of concern regarding the extreme neoliberalist model of governance that seems to be squeezing more and more people out of participating in their own communities. And so it's a broad general concern that doesn't have any one policy or one direct issue. It's more to do with, I think, the general overall system in decline. That seems to be hurting people at the moment, more and more people, especially the middle classes.
One of the central demands of the Occupy movement is greater democracy. Now, I wondered how much the protesters here had been inspired by the pro-democracy revolutions in the Arab world. Meanwhile, the head of London's stock exchange said that the protesters shouldn't be angry with the banks, but with the politicians that allowed the banks, through their reckless money-making practices, to become so rich. So who's really to blame? Well, let's find out what the people think.
Yes and no. Maybe the concept of let's have a revolution and let's sort of protest for our rights, maybe that caught on, but I don't think that they'll be officially linked. I don't think you could draw a solid link between them.
No, I haven't really thought about it at all. No, I hadn't really considered it.
The protesters in the UK here are saying they want greater democracy and accountability. Do you think they were inspired at all by the events in the Arab world, where obviously pro-democracy revolutions took place earlier this year?
They may be linking their thoughts into that, but I think we had protests here before the Arab Spring. I mean, this sort of thing has been going on for several years, really.
Yeah, I think everything in the world is interconnected, so it may have had some, influence, and Egypt is kind of an inspiration for their way of peaceful demonstration. So, yeah, I think it's somewhat connected, though not directly, because it's a bit different. One is more economic and one is more a kind of human rights, though certainly economic as well.
I'm not so sure that they're linked, to be honest. Personally, I'm not so sure I see a link between the two, but who knows?
I think consciously or subconsciously everybody has been inspired by that. It's taught us that even the most downtrodden people can have a voice if they come together and band together.
I doubt it. I mean, I suppose it's a possibility for some of them. I doubt it for most, though.
I'm not an expert on what's been going on there, but I think definitely as an inspiration, yeah. And we consider it a worldwide movement, so I think there is a relationship. I think if we were over there, we'd be in those protests. If they were here, they'd be in St Paul's.
The chairman of the London Stock Exchange, Chris Gibson-Smith, said that the protesters should actually drive their anger at the government for allowing the bankers to make all that money through those complicated financial practices. Is that fair? Should the protest be against the government and not the bankers?
No, I think that's a very, very important point about this protest, is that we're not protesting against the government, because we know that the Corporation of London isn't answerable direct to the government, and they have their own, well, I would say they have their own laws and their own ability to do what they like.
Well, it's all about finance, so even if they directed it towards the government, it's a finance issue, so therefore you can't live out the stock exchange.
If they're going to direct it to the government, there's been people outside the Houses of Parliament for ages that have had big, smoke screens put round about it, so it's going to be quite ineffective, I feel. And obviously it's got people talking about it, and it is next to the stock exchange from where, the monetary sort of issues of the United Kingdom is carried out. So I don't think, going to Westminster's necessarily, or directing it Westminster's necessarily.
I think there's not an appreciation of the work that the ordinary people in the financial institutions in the city do actually do, and their contribution to the economy. They're paying taxes. London is a financial centre, a world financial centre, and I think that needs to be recognised as well, because after all, we haven't got anything else. No, we don't manufacture, do we?
Well, it's difficult, isn't it, to disentangle complex social structures. So I think it's difficult to know who you blame for what. But certainly, of course, the government holds a great deal of responsibility.
Well, yes and no. I think the government are the ones that are going to bring change overall. But I think, generally speaking, if people rise up and show their disbelief and their dissatisfaction, the government will have to take note and and make a change based on that.
The head of the British stock market has said that the protesters shouldn't be angry with the banks and the financial institutions because they only did, that is, make loads of money because the politicians passed laws that allowed them to. Has he got a fair point?
No, it's nonsense. The politicians are bought by the money. It's a circle. They buy the politicians, and they really do.
Well, I think everybody has to be responsible for themselves, you know. It's no point government telling them what to do, you know, if they're not responsible. And then we just saw in the news lately that the city of London has too much power and has really it doesn't answer to government at all.
No, I don't think so. I think these institutions make their own rules and their own wage packets up. The government doesn't make their wage packets up.
Yeah, but who's holding the politicians by the throat? I mean, sure, he's right. It's the politicians and it's the bankers. They're friends, they're helping each other. They don't care about the rest of us.
Yes, I do. Yes, I think the people in politics earn so much money for doing so little, and there's people out in the streets that work so hard and they get no recognition for it at all. So yeah, I do agree that they should go to the government.
I think part of the problem is that the financial sector and the government are working so closely that it's hard to distinguish a lot of what's going on.
Well, differing views there from the public on the streets of London. Let's see who our experts agree with.
I think it's been inspired by the pro-democracy demonstrations, and I think it's been inspired by what happened in Greece and then Spain. And this, people have been frustrated because they don't see a way to influence policy through government and through lobbying and the traditional channels, which don't seem to be working. And this is a way that people can actually get involved and discuss what needs to happen. I think it has to be the government that makes the changes. I don't think you can expect corporations to change the way they operate against their own self-interest. So I think the pressure has to be on government, but I think it's good to keep the focus on the banking sector and the financial sector and not let people believe that everything has gone back to being business as usual. That's the worst thing we can do. Let's go back to business as usual. There's a lot of people who generally agree with the sentiment that the financial sector is doing well at the expense of everybody else. And I think there's a lot of people who would support it, but for whatever reason couldn't actually be there. In terms of whether it will make Britain democratic, I think we've got a long way to go in terms of reforming the political system, reforming the financial system, and reforming the economic system in a way that is more democratic, where ordinary people have more control rather than the people who actually know how to game the system.
There doesn't seem to be among the movement and among many people in our society today much of a difference between the government and the banking system. They seem to be part of a common project, which I've called in my work extreme neoliberalism. A common project, and it's difficult after the bailouts, the banking bailouts, after so much exchange between the banks and the government to see actually a real institutional difference. So it's a refusal of the government's management of society through these neoliberal means, but also a deep concern and protest against a banking system that's simply geared to enrich the rich and squeeze everyone else, the 99%, I guess. So I think that public opinion does seem to be behind the idea that they do stay, and it is, if you think about it, a reclamation of a public space that I think is quite interesting in terms of what is being achieved. Rather than just being a one-off protest, which is important but so often in the past has failed to really generate meaningful change, I think the occupation is something that is quite useful for raising issues that I think concern a lot of us.
The City of London wanted to remove these protesters from St. Paul's Square until members of the religious community came out and spoke in their favour. Well, should they be allowed to stay camped out here and continue their peaceful protest? And if they're successful, will they make the powerful financial institutions more accountable to the British public?
Well, I mean, tents aren't dangerous, are they, of themselves? So I think they should be allowed to stay. On the other hand, you understand that people find it irritating and so on. So I suppose there's something to be said on both sides, but I think they're not doing much harm.
I think this, the whole of the United Kingdom is about freedom of speech, and I think if you try to quash that, it's going to lead to more problems in the long run for both the government and anyone that tries to stop it. So I think if they let it take its course, a change will happen, or else they'll give up. It's going to be one of the other.
The Corporation of London actually wanted to prevent the protesters remaining until members of St Paul's Cathedral actually spoke out in favour. How did that happen, do you think?
Well, I think it would have been very helpful for the Corporation of London if St Paul's had continued to try and evict the protesters here, and was without the support of the Church of England. Then I think they know that it would have been an extremely unpopular move, and it would have created a lot of media attention for the protest, because if they tried to remove them, it would have been by force. And if they do remove these people without an agreement, then they probably will be forced involved.
I think they should be allowed to stay. I think it's fantastic, and I think that a lot of these these people who have been involved, they have actually developed quite a good relationship with a lot of the people who are, religious ministers at St Paul's, which I found very interesting.
Well, it's a strange situation. I mean, basically, they can't stay there. But at the same time, I think that by now they've achieved their goal, which is to basically air their view as regards the situation. But they can't be there forever.
Obviously, the City of London wanted to wanted to break up the protests until members of St Paul's Cathedral spoke out in favour. What did you think of that?
I was actually on the steps when Giles Fraser arrived that morning. I was stood next to him when he told the police that I'd like you to move on, which they did. He told us all we could stay. Maybe finally the church has stood up for humans. Finally. We've waited a long time.
Well, I certainly think that it would be very difficult for the Christian religious leaders to sort of chuck them all out. That would make things a lot more of a problem for them. I think people would start questioning their morals.
Well, if the religious leaders are happy for them to stay and they're not I can't see them causing any trouble apart from just there's a load of tents everywhere, which again is a little bit unsightly for London, especially people coming into the city. But if the religious leaders are happy for them to stay, then why not? They're not causing any trouble, are they? So yeah, fine, go on with it. Yeah, brilliant.
Do you think they'll succeed?
I think they won't go until they feel people have begun to listen to them, and that's right.
I think so, because they've got quite a lot of attention, but I think that's mainly because they're there. I don't really know whether the message is getting across, because I don't know anything about it.
The problems that go on are way beyond sort of protesting, and it's not like someone striking to get a higher pay or whatever. The problems go way beyond that. So really, saying their success was probably not the right thing to say. But if they've had their voice heard, then maybe it gives people sort of the chance to think about things more. But it's certainly not going to solve the problems of just now.
I think it already has succeeded to an extent, and I think it will succeed more. I think as they stick at it, and I think they will stick at it. There's a widespread support for it, as I understand it.
I don't really know. I don't think so. Not really. It's a little drop in the ocean.
No, not really. I'm not sure that much of a change can be achieved through those sort of paths. Yeah, I'm not sure.
Do you think it will succeed?
I hope so. That remains to be seen.
I hope it makes some part of a difference, but I don't think it's going to be entirely effective, because something systematic has to change, not necessarily with the government, but with just the systems of banking.
I'm afraid that's all we've got time for. Thank you for joining us. If you've got something to say yourself, send an email to asimplequestion@presstv.com. That's asimplequestion@presstv.com. Meanwhile, I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.